Today, children, I'm going to tell you the story of The Farmer Prince, written by Elizabeth Stubbs. Mother of the fairy tale, take me by your silver hand, sail me on your silver boat, sail me silently afloat. Mother of the fairy tale, take me to your shining land. Once upon a time, there was a king who lived in his castle on a tall hill in the very center of his kingdom. Surrounding the hill was a lush valley full of fields and orchards. The king had 3 sons, the princes, who lived there with him. Every day the king and his sons would go up to the top of the tallest tower in the kingdom and stand on the turret, looking out. On one side of the kingdom, they could see the blue ocean stretching as far as the eye could see. On the other side, they could see the mountains, row upon row, fading into the far distance. The king would point out various wonders to his sons, and together each day they would thank the good Lord for all the blessings that surrounded them. They dwelt happily there, and time passed. The king's beard grew very white, and one day he said to his sons, "I grow old, my dear children. One day I shall pass from this world to the next, and one of you shall take my place on the throne. Go, each of you, out into the world. Find out what God wants of each of you, and do His work. In 1 year's time, return to me, and tell me what you have learned. Then I shall choose which one of you is to rule after my death." The 3 brothers were sad to leave one another and their old father, but they embraced each other and took their leave. The oldest built a wooden ship and sailed away over the blue ocean. The second saddled his finest horse and set off to climb the mountains. The third and youngest son thought and thought about what he should do. He was a dreamy sort of a boy who had always been quite content to stay at home. He puzzled over it, but came to no answer. At last he set off on foot, following his nose, down the hill into the valley surrounding the castle. Before long he came to a field where toiled a young peasant lad about his age and size, who bowed deeply to him. "Good day, your lordship," the peasant murmured politely. The young prince returned his greeting and invited him to share a drink of cool water he had brought with him in a flask. They sat down in the shade of a tree to refresh themselves, and the prince asked the peasant lad to tell him about his work. "Why, I am up with the sun," explained the peasant lad. "I come to this field each day to plant, to sow, to harvest, and to mow." "And do you love your work?" asked the prince. "It is what I do," answered the lad simply. They talked a little more, until the peasant bowed to the young prince and excused himself to return to his work. The prince watched him a while longer from the shade of the tree. After a while the prince hailed him, and they spoke some more. Soon they made a bargain. First, they switched clothes. They laughed to see each dressed in the other's garments. Next, the prince traded the peasant a bag of gold coins for his bag of seeds. And they thanked each other and took leave. The peasant lad went off very happily indeed, looking quite fine and feeling that he had the better part of the bargain. The prince, in peasant garb, set to work in the field, humming a little tune. The sun was hot and his back ached, but he kept planting seeds until the shadows began to grow long. As the sun sank low, he finished seeding the last row. He took off the peasant lad's tattered straw hat and looked at the field. The neat furrows were all planted with seeds. Now he would have to wait and see what would grow up from the earth. He felt satisfied that he had done well. At the bottom of the field there was a small rough house, just as the peasant lad had told him. There he went to spend the night. In the palace of the king he had had a feather bed, deep and soft, with silken sheets and soft-woven blankets. In the peasant's hovel there was only a pile of straw with a rough sackcloth cover, but no matter. He did not forget to thank the good Lord for his many blessings, and then the prince fell into a deep sleep. In the morning the sun rose and the prince awoke with it. When he went to the field, he noticed that some weeds had sprouted in the night. He took the peasant lad's old hoe and began hoeing the weeds away from where the seedlings would appear. It was tiring work, but the prince kept at it all day, whistling cheerfully as he worked. And when the sun was nearly set, he had finished the last row. Now that the weeds were pulled away, the new seedlings would have plenty of room to grow big and strong. That night he said his prayers and slept as soundly as before. The next morning he awoke with the sun. It was blazing hot, and the prince knew when he got to the field that the little seeds were going to need water. He found a dented old watering can and went to the little stream at the bottom of the field. He filled the can, walked back again, and began to water the seeds, singing a joyful tune. It required many trips with the heavy watering can, and once more the prince found himself very tired indeed. The shadows began to grow long, and just as the sun was setting, he finished watering the last row. He put the can down and brushed his hair off of his forehead. As he looked at all the watered rows, he felt satisfied. He returned to his hovel for the night. He washed his hands and face and prepared himself a simple supper. After he washed the cooking pot, he gave thanks and again fell into a deep sleep. The next morning the prince arose with the sun, and when he got to the field he was very happy to see that the seedlings had come up. He was most surprised to see many rabbits hopping about, nibbling on the tender seedlings. He chased them away and knew what today's work would be. He would have to build a fence to keep the rabbits out of the garden. All day he went into the woods to find brush and windfalls, which he dragged back to the field and wove together into a wattle fence. It was hard work, and he suffered many scrapes and scratches as he built the fence. But he sang cheerfully the whole day long. As the sun sank low in the sky, he finished the last section. The prince stood and surveyed his work. The rows of little seedlings looked as though they were reaching toward the heavens. And so it went, day in and day out. There was always work to be done in the field, and little rest. But the prince kept at it happily, singing as he worked. He grew strong and his skin turned brown. His back did not hurt him any longer. Sometimes villagers stopped along the road to listen for a few minutes to the wonderful songs the farmer sang as he worked. The seedlings turned into sturdy little plants. They needed to be staked up, watered, and weeded. They grew taller and taller, and at last they needed to be harvested. And what grew in that field? There were all sorts of things: sweet, crisp carrots, sharp radishes, beets, tender lettuces, parsnips, savory herbs, juicy tomatoes and peppers. There were flowers, too, daisies, golden lilies, carnations, huge dahlias, and sweet-smelling freesias. Each Saturday, he would load the peasant lad's old wheelbarrow and trundle off to the market, where he would sell his beautiful vegetables and flowers. Although the villagers did not know who he really was, they would look for him and line up to buy his wares. One market day, there was a courtier from the castle of the king. He wore a worried look on his face, and as he shopped for food in the market, the word was passed around that the old king had fallen ill. The prince was aggrieved to hear this, and wanted to go to his father, but the year had not quite passed. Keeping his peasant's disguise, he offered the courtier a basket of vegetables, and instructed him in how to make a healthy broth, for he had learned this art himself, having cooked his own meals each day and night. The courtier thanked him and hurried back to the castle to prepare the soup. That night, the prince said extra prayers for his father. The next week at market, the courtier sought out the man who had given him the vegetables. "Thank you, good fellow," said the courtier. "His Majesty feels better. His body is healed, but his soul is still ailing." The prince this time gave the courtier a basket of fresh flowers to put beside the king's bedside, for he had learned that flowers are like healing balm to the troubles of the soul. The courtier thanked him and hurried back to the castle to place the flowers by the bedside of the king. The following week at market, the courtier came once more to find the man who had given him the vegetables and the flowers. "Good fellow, the king feels better in both body and soul, but alas, his spirit is ailing, and I do not know how to help him." "Ah," said the prince, "you must sing to him." "Sing?" asked the courtier. "What shall I sing?" "Anything at all that makes him happy," said the prince. But the courtier hesitated and said, "Young man, my voice is cracked and dry from years of disuse. I can no longer sing. Will you come and sing yourself for the king?" The prince promised to come and sing outside the king's window that evening. The courtier thanked him and hurried back to the castle. Later that night, when all was quiet, the prince crept up the tall hill and sang for the king, who stopped tossing and turning in his bed and fell into a deep sleep. He sang until the moon was high, and then he tiptoed away for a few hours' rest. Soon the year had passed, and it was time for the three princes to return to their father and tell of their adventures. The oldest prince was the first to arrive back at the castle. He wore the clothes of a ship's captain and was laden down with sacks of silks and spices. Next followed the middle son, who wore the clothes of an adventurer, carrying caskets of gold and furs from faraway lands. At last there came a rather ragged-looking peasant lad, trudging up the hill in his dusty boots, pushing a rickety wheelbarrow filled with vegetables and flowers. When he knocked at the gate of the palace, the gatekeeper did not recognize him and would not let him in. But the courtier, who had met him in the market, knew him immediately and insisted that the gate be opened for him. When at last they were all assembled before the throne, he threw off his peasant disguise, and they knew him once more. The three brothers greeted each other and their father with great joy. The old king was delighted to have his sons with him once again. They each told of their adventures during the year that they were apart from each other. The eldest prince had sailed across the sea to strange lands far away. He had brought back bright silks and rare spices, and many stories of exotic people in far lands. I have glorified God because I have traveled to see his creation across the seas, he declared. And his brothers marveled at all that he said. The middle prince had explored the mountains and the hills beyond. He had brought back bright gems and gold and rare furs. He too had many stories of strange people in different places. I have glorified God because I have traveled to see his creation across the mountains, he said. And his brothers listened, spellbound, to his tales of adventure. The youngest prince cast down his eyes. I have not gone very far, he said. I have been living the life of a farmer down in the valley. I have no adventures to tell of. I have no treasure to share but what has grown in my garden. I know only how the seeds push up through the earth toward the stars. I know only how the earth loves the rain and the way the birds sing in the morning light. But I know God's own work, and I have been content. No one spoke. There was a rustle in the corner, and the courtier stepped forward. Please, your majesty, may I speak? The old king nodded, and the courtier said, This is the man who provided the vegetables for the king's soup when his body was ailing. This is the man who provided flowers for his soul's comfort. And this is also the one whose songs lifted the spirits of the king. Then the two older brothers and their father embraced the younger son with heartfelt thanks. They agreed that indeed it was he who should be king, as he had learned best the way God wants men to work in the world. The three brothers returned to the castle to live with their old father. They married and raised children and lived quite contentedly together, sharing the work and the joys of their lives. Each night before the fire, they would share all manner of adventure stories and songs. The youngest son, of course, kept a wonderful garden and continued to grow remarkable things. The old king was happy to have his children and grandchildren all around him. He ruled wisely and well, with his youngest son at his side, until his death. Afterwards, the youngest became the king and ruled wisely and well. It was always said of him that he was never afraid of hard work. And they all dwelt there, happily ever after. Snip, snap, snout. Now my tale's told out. Thank you for listening to this story today. If you'd like to get updates when I upload a new video on form drawing, stories, or circles, please subscribe to my channel.